So if you're anything like me, you've probably had some extra time on your hands the past few months, and I've tried to put my time to somewhat good use. I've cleaned out a lot of different parts of this house, including here in the kitchen. And when I was doing so, I came across this cookbook. It's just the McCall's cookbook. There's nothing special about this book in particular, and obviously, I don't know if you can see this, but it has seen better days. But it's a special cookbook for me because it was a gift to me from my grandmother over 30 years ago. She gave it to me in Christmas 1989, and she inscribed it inside. And she said, "To the pumpkin cookie kid from the butterscotch bar lady." Now, I honestly don't really remember making pumpkin cookies, but apparently 30 years ago that was something that I did. But I definitely remember my grandmother making butterscotch squares. That was a recipe that just represented her. It was the quintessential her. And when I would go over to her house and she would have those out, it was just fantastic. And so it's always been a very special memory. Eventually, now the recipe is not actually in the cookbook itself. Eventually, she gave me the recipe on a 3x5 card in her own handwriting, of course. This too has seen better days, and I finally got around to putting it into a plastic sleeve to try to keep it safe. But I look at this and I see her handwriting and recognize it immediately, and just I feel so good with the memories that this produces for me. And so as we approached Lammas this year, I thought, well, why don't we try actually making some butterscotch squares? Because after all, they do include flour, hometown team, they do include flour, and that is, of course, the key to any Lammas celebration for you purists who are out there. So the first thing that we're doing is we have to melt butter. And it's a stick and a half of butter. So I've already gone ahead and done that. Now, my grandmother, when she wrote this recipe out, she made a point of making sure to underline for me that you're supposed to let the butter cool a bit. This was an expensive lesson on my part, learned when I tried to make her pecan pie. That also included butter and eggs and whatnot, and I did not let the butter cool, just cracked some eggs into it and off we went. And I didn't realize that in doing that, that basically started cooking the eggs. And the entire pie tasted just like an omelet. And there's nothing wrong with the taste of an omelet, but when you bite into it thinking you're getting pecan pie, that's kind of a wake-up call right there. And so we take the stick and a half of butter, and then we add to that 1.5 cups, make sure I have that right here, 2 cups, I almost got that wrong, that would have been all good, 2 cups of brown sugar. So you know that this is going to be basically healthy. Between the butter and the sugar, I guess I could have measured this out earlier, but I think that's about right. Put that right there. There we go. Now, it's not just that I have the handwritten card. When my grandmother died about 11 years ago or so, something like that, my father was the one who ended up cleaning out her house. And in going through her papers, he found something that he shared a copy of with me, which was this newspaper article. Now, my grandmother, back in about the 60s or so, she wrote a column for the Detroit Free Press. And this is a photocopy of one of her columns. It's not dated, but I believe it's from the 1960s. And it's got a kind of an awkward title in today's understanding of things. The headline is, "Don't be a slave to pots and pans." We wouldn't say that today. And then she goes on, also disturbingly, here's the lazy way to cook. Lazy. I don't think of my grandmother as lazy, but that's how she described it. But there's more that's in this story that's probably even a bit more surprising to me. So you just mix the butter and the brown sugar. Oh my God, this is looking good already. If I weren't on camera, I would just eat it right out of the bowl. But then people talk. Okay. So to this, we add 2 eggs. And we mix them up a little bit first before we add them in. Now, in case you're worried, I have been letting the butter cool a little bit already so that hopefully it's not going to start cooking the eggs while we speak. There we go. So, in her column, what my grandmother says is that, she celebrates this recipe. It's so easy. She's lazy, apparently. But then she says, I was delighted when a dear friend from Cleveland, Ohio, Ruth Abley, wife of the late Colonel Lester J. Abley, of course, gave me this lazy recipe for butterscotch square bars. And I thought, your dear friend Ruth Abley? How can it be that this recipe that I associate with her wasn't hers? Anyway, I mixed the butter and the eggs and the brown sugar all together into, oh my goodness, it looks like syrup practically. I don't know if you can even see that, but it looks really, really good. Now at this point, I add a little bit of vanilla. My grandmother, in her recipe, says it's a teaspoon. Sometimes she just calls it a glug. I don't know. But there, about a teaspoon. Maybe that's a little bit generous, but, it's vanilla. Can't go wrong. So here's the thing about that article. My grandmother refers to Ruth Abley as her dear friend. Well, bless your heart. But as it turns out, what my grandmother didn't actually mention in the article was that Ruth and Lester had been her in-laws, had been her parents-in-law. My grandmother had been married to the colonel's son, my grandfather. Sadly, the marriage didn't last, and by the time my grandmother wrote that article, apparently it was more convenient just to sort of, set him off to the side while giving a nice reference to his parents. Now, my grandfather and my great-grandfather both had this sort of unusual approach to family. Each of them got married, had a son, divorced, remarried, and had 2 more kids. That also was not in the article that my grandmother published in the paper. At this point, now we add some kind of boring ingredients. There's some salt, and I believe this is a half a teaspoon of salt. Are you getting all this? Half a teaspoon of salt. Don't do too much, because then everything starts tasting like salt. But a half a teaspoon of salt, and my grandmother says a scant teaspoon of baking powder. I'm kind of a fan of baking powder, so I put in a little bit more. Not a ton, but it's not quite as scant as maybe she would have. There we go. So, I have this uncle. He's actually on my mother's side, but he's taken a fascination to my father's family. And he's just fantastic with all this genealogy and Ancestry.com and blah, 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 all of that stuff. He has been digging in to my father's family. And lo and behold, he turns up the daughters from my grandfather's second marriage. They're half-aunts. One of them lives in Boston, and one of them lives in Seattle. And he put us all in touch. And we've begun to speak and get to know each other, and that's fantastic. And my father met with his half-sister first. And they were just having a conversation and talking about family history, because that's, of course, the thing that puts us all together. And one thing leads to another, and he refers to this article in the reference to Abley's, and his sister says, oh my gosh, the butterscotch square, of course. Everybody knows about that. We've been making those for years. Well, you could knock me over with a feather. Crazy. All right, so now that this looks like it's in pretty good shape, now for the main course for Lammas, because, got to do that, and that is flour. Now, this is 1.5 cups of flour. I thought about wearing a white shirt just in case I ended up wearing all of this flour on it, but I'm taking a chance just to see if I can make it happen without a lot of chaos. So 1.5 cups of flour. Now, I mentioned a moment ago that my great-grandfather and grandfather both had this thing going on where they marry once, have a kid, divorce, marry a second time, and have more. So it might not come as a great surprise to you that my uncle, the genealogy buff, he's been digging into my great-grandfather's family as well. And lo and behold, my uncle turns up some of the descendants from my great-grandfather's second marriage. Now, there's quite a number of them, and I've only met one. She's a very nice person. I think of her as my cousin. She's really my father's cousin, and she lives outside of Boston. And we've gotten together as well. She was here in the Twin Cities about 2 years ago or so for a conference. And we were talking, and I said, well, why don't we get together and chat, get to know each other a little bit? And she says, that sounds wonderful. And I said, well, let me invite my father. So he comes in from Detroit. And perhaps you know where this is going. One thing leads to another, chat. Up comes the article, and my cousin says, the butterscotch square bars. Grandma Ruth's butterscotch bars. And again, my father and I are just floored. How is this possible that this amazing family recipe of ours, the thing that embodies my grandmother, is really not hers and is shared by all of these people? It put us on edge. That's all I can really say. All right. So now this is pretty well mixed up. It's pretty well mixed. How about that? All right. Now my grandmother, bless her heart, she knew what kind of a cook I was. And she said, make sure that you use a very well-greased pan. Now she wanted a bigger pan than this. This is a little bit small, but it's what I have. And I use pan because I'm cheap. So we will give this a try and hope for the best. Now I hope the camera is picking this up. This looks like molten taffy. And it smells very good and looks fantastic. And we're trying to get all of it in the pan and not on the counter and not on me. I'm going to try and get most of it out of the bowl, but I might not be able to get absolutely all of it out of the bowl and off the spatula. And once the camera's off, I don't know how I'm going to clean that. But hopefully I'll come up with something. And so there you go. Now, this goes in the oven at 325. Now, my recipe says for 30 minutes. My experience is you need to bump it up closer to 40, but I check it pretty regularly once you get to that half-hour mark. So I just put it into the oven at 325 and sit back and wait for the aroma. I've made this recipe now many times in my life. I have to look every single time to figure out what the proportions are. But every time I do it, it just reminds me of my grandmother. Like I say, she's been gone now for a number of years. But when I make what I've always thought of as her butterscotch squares, I can see her, I can hear her. She had a way of talking with her hands. I can see that as plain as day. I can see her kitchen, the things that were on the wall, things that were on the counters. I can see the whole house. I haven't been in it in a decade, but it's like I'm there right now. And this recipe, maybe it's not hers. Maybe she got it from her dear friend, former mother-in-law Ruth, which is fantastic. But now, when I make this same recipe, now I think about her. I think about a great-grandmother whom I never met. And obviously now there are all these other people too. These aunts on opposite ends of the continent, a cousin in New England. All of these people I'm connected to. They say that blood is thicker than water, and I got to tell you, if you were watching, butterscotch is thicker even still. And somehow this recipe, a bit of flour, a bit of butter, a whole lot of brown sugar, becomes a vehicle for thinking about the connections I have to people who are distant from me geographically, people who have gone before me, people, like I say, I never met. And it seems to me that sharing food, sharing meals, sharing recipes is a way that we promote and sustain connections, and we promote and sustain a community of people, a family, a congregation, an entire ethnic group. Here at FUS, we've celebrated Lammas in August for something like 10 years now. And for those of you who've been, you know that kind of the tradition is we have an assembly as you would expect, and then we go downstairs and we have that fresh-baked bread that Jean and her team put together. And it's not just about Lammas. It is, of course. But it's also about the connections. How we all come together for a tradition, for a meal, a recipe that we have passed down through the congregation. It's just what we do. It's part of who we are. And Lammas is an opportunity not just to celebrate our ties to the cycle of the seasons, but our ties to one another, including even today, when it's harder than usual. Hold on. Now, you may be wondering, how do I get my hands on an oven that bakes things so quickly, cools them to the touch so quickly, takes them out of the pan, cuts them up, and puts them on a platter? You know, it's an amazing thing. And it really just boils down to, you got to know the right people. This looks and smells fantastic. And as I think about digging into this, mostly once the camera's off, I'm curious to know, what recipes do you have in your family that have been passed down through the generations that remind you of somebody you know or knew, loved? What are the recipes that you yourself are creating that you might pass along? We're in a very unusual time right now. Perhaps this is an opportunity to create a dish of your own, pass it along, so that 100 years from now they'll say, oh, that's what our great-grandparents ate during the pandemic of 20. Whatever it is, maybe this is an opportunity to get that recipe out and try making it. If you haven't in a long time, try producing that again. And then, as you do, take a bite. Oh my God. I'd forgotten. My goodness. But take a bite, savor the taste of what you've made, and savor the relationships and the connections that you have, either literally or figuratively, to the people with whom you're sharing it. Family, friends, community. However you do it, enjoy. Have a great Lammas.